The first time my mother said it out loud, the room went silent in a way I will never forget. It was the Saturday before Christmas. Snow pressed against the windows of my parents' house in Westbridge, like a warning no one wanted to read. The dining room was dressed for the holidays. Linen tablecloth, polished silver candles, burning with that sweet pine scent my mother insisted meant family. I was sitting at the far end of the table, the same seat I had taken since I was a teenager, close enough to be present, far enough to be ignored. I had just turned 30. No cake, no card, no acknowledgement beyond a distracted nod from my father when I arrived. My older sister Claire sat beside our mother, glowing with the soft confidence of someone who had always known she belonged. Her engagement ring caught the candlelight every time she moved her hand, which was often. She liked people to notice. My brother-in-law-to-be, Mark, leaned back in his chair, one arm draped possessively over Claire's, smiling the smile of a man who had already won. Dinner had barely started when my mother cleared her throat. "We've made some decisions," she said, folding her napkin with care. "Important ones." My father didn't look at me when he spoke next. "This is about the future," he said, "about protecting what we've built." I felt something tighten in my chest, that tone. The one that meant I wasn't part of the conversation, only its consequence. Claire reached for her wine glass. "Mom, maybe not tonight." My mother waved her off. "No, it's better to be clear." She turned to me, then her eyes sharp, assessing like she was looking at a stranger who had overstayed her welcome. "Rachel," she said, "you've always been different." There it was, the word she used whenever I disappointed her by not becoming what she wanted. Different meant inconvenient, different meant unmanageable. I forced a small smile. "Different how?" She sighed as if burdened by the need to explain something obvious. "You don't fit into the family plan. You never have." My father finally looked at me. His expression was tight, practiced. "We can't rely on you." The words landed heavier than a slap. Claire shifted uncomfortably, but she didn't speak. "We've updated the will." My mother continued, her voice calm, almost gentle. "Claire will inherit the house, the accounts, the company shares. Everything will stay stable." I waited. Some small, foolish part of me waited for the rest. "There's nothing left for you," she said finally. "It's cleaner this way." Cleaner, as if I were clutter. The candles flickered. Somewhere in the house, the clock ticked loud and unforgiving. "You're cutting me out," I said. My father nodded. "It's for the best." "For who?" I asked. "For the family," my mother said, as if that explained everything. I laughed once, a short sound that surprised even me. "I am the family." My mother's lips tightened. "Not in the ways that matter." No one spoke after that. The silence stretched thick and suffocating until I felt like I might disappear inside it. I stood slowly, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor. My hands were steady, which felt like a small miracle. "Thank you for being honest," I said. "I wish you'd done it sooner." Claire finally looked at me, guilt flickering across her face. "Rachel, it's not personal." I met her eyes. "It's always personal." I walked out without my coat, without dessert, without saying goodbye. The cold outside hit me like a slap, sharp and cleansing. Snow crunched under my shoes as I crossed the driveway, my breath coming fast, uneven. I didn't cry, not yet. I drove until the house lights disappeared in my rearview mirror. That night, sitting alone in my apartment, I replayed every moment I had ever tried to earn their approval, every birthday forgotten, every promotion dismissed, every holiday where I brought gifts and left feeling smaller than when I arrived. They hadn't cut me out because I failed. They cut me out because I refused to become invisible. What I didn't know then was that my mother had lied, not about the will, about why I was excluded. And I didn't yet understand that the thing they thought they had taken from me would become the very weapon that would bring everything they valued crashing down. At the time, all I knew was this: they had erased me, and something inside me had finally stopped trying to be written back in. The morning after Christmas tasted like metal. I woke before dawn on my couch, fully dressed, my coat still folded over the arm like an afterthought. My phone lay face down on the coffee table. No missed calls, no messages, not from my parents, not from Claire, not even from my aunt, who usually played peacemaker when things went wrong. Silence had always been their favorite punishment. I made coffee and drank it standing by the window, watching the city wake up. A woman across the street scraped ice from her windshield, her breath visible in short bursts. Somewhere a siren wailed and faded. Life went on indifferent to my small personal disaster. That was when the second blow landed. I checked my email. There was a message from Human Resources at Ellison and Grant, the consulting firm, where I had worked for almost 6 years. The subject line was neutral, almost polite. Position update. I opened it slowly, my thumb hovering like it already knew what was coming. Due to restructuring and shifting priorities, your role has been eliminated, effective immediately. We appreciate your contributions and wish you the best in your future endeavors. No warning, no conversation, no chance to respond. I sank onto the edge of the couch, the room tilting slightly. My job hadn't just been a paycheck, it had been my proof. The one thing I could point to when my family asked, "What are you doing with your life?" I scrolled down. A severance package, minimal, almost insulting. Then I saw the line that made my stomach drop. This decision follows feedback received from external stakeholders. External stakeholders. I knew exactly who those were. My father sat on 2 boards that partnered regularly with Ellison and Grant. He had introduced me to the firm years ago with pride, telling everyone his youngest daughter was sharp, reliable, dependable. The praise had dried up the moment I stopped agreeing with him. I called my manager, straight to voicemail. I called again, same result. When she finally called back, her voice was strained, rehearsed. "I'm so sorry, Rachel," she said. This came from above. "From who?" I asked. She hesitated. "Your father made some calls." The word father felt foreign on her tongue. "He questioned your judgment," she continued. "Said you were emotionally unstable, difficult, a liability." I closed my eyes. "I defended you," she added quickly. "But when the board gets nervous—" "I understand," I said, though I didn't. We hung up and I sat there for a long time staring at the blank wall. They hadn't just cut me out of the will. They were dismantling my life piece by piece. By noon my phone buzzed. "Claire." I almost didn't answer. "Rachel," she said softly, "I just heard." "Did you?" I replied. She sighed. "Dad said you'd be upset." Upset, as if this were a misunderstanding, not an execution. "He told them I was unstable," I said. There was a pause. "He was trying to protect the family." "The family," I repeated, "not me." "You're being dramatic," she said gently. "This is just a rough patch." A rough patch. I laughed, a hollow sound that surprised us both. "You took everything I said. The inheritance, the house, and now my career." "That's not fair," she said. "I didn't ask him to do that." "But you didn't stop him," I replied. Silence stretched between us. "Rachel," she said finally, "you've always been too sensitive." There it was again. The word that made everything my fault. "I'm hanging up now," I said. She started to protest, but I ended the call. That afternoon, I walked through my apartment like a stranger. My bookshelf, my desk, the framed diploma my parents had paid for and never let me forget. I pulled it off the wall and leaned it face down against the couch. By evening, the shock had curdled into something sharper. Anger, not loud anger, focused anger. I opened my laptop and started writing. Not resumes, not cover letters. Notes, dates, names, calls my father had made, meetings he had attended, deals that seemed too clean, too fast. I had seen things over the years, contracts pushed through, zoning approvals that skipped steps, complaints buried under committees. At the time, I had told myself it wasn't my business. Now it was. I called a former colleague, Daniel, someone who had been quietly sidelined after questioning a development project my father supported. He answered on the second ring. "I was wondering when you'd call," he said. "You knew?" I asked. "Everyone knew," he replied. "We just didn't think you'd be the one they'd come for." We talked for hours. He told me things I hadn't known, things he hadn't dared say out loud, names of officials, patterns, favors traded like currency. By the time we hung up, the sun had set and my coffee had gone cold. I wasn't imagining it. They weren't just cruel. They were careful, and that made them dangerous. As I closed my laptop, a strange calm settled over me. The fear was still there, but it no longer controlled me. They had taken everything they thought I needed to survive, which meant I had nothing left to lose. What they didn't know was that I had spent years learning how their world worked. I had watched from the edges, listened when they thought I wasn't paying attention. They believed cutting me out would make me disappear. Instead, it had finally made me look directly at the truth. And once you see the truth, you can never unsee it. That night, lying awake in the dark, I made myself a promise. I would not beg, I would not plead, and I would not rebuild my life quietly. If they wanted to erase me, I would make sure the process of doing so exposed everything they had hidden. They had declared war without realizing it, and I was done being collateral damage. By the 3rd day after Christmas, the anger stopped shaking. That was how I knew it had turned dangerous. I woke before my alarm, my body already alert, my mind sharp in a way it hadn't been in years. The grief was still there, but it had moved to the background like noise. You stop noticing once something more urgent takes over. I wasn't spiraling anymore. I was organizing. I spent the morning pulling bank statements, old emails, archived files from my work laptop I hadn't yet returned. I wasn't stealing anything. I wasn't hiding anything. I was simply collecting what already existed, what had been ignored because it was inconvenient. Patterns emerge when you stop telling yourself everything is a coincidence. My father, Leonard Walsh, had built his reputation on stability. He was known as a conservative businessman, a man who didn't take risks. That image had protected him for decades. But stability doesn't happen by accident. It happens because someone is quietly controlling the variables. I had seen him do it at home. Redirect conversations, shut down questions, reward obedience, punish dissent. Why would the boardroom be any different? Around noon, my phone buzzed, a number I didn't recognize. Rachel Walsh, a man said when I answered. "This is Evan Brooks." The name sent a ripple through me. Evan Brooks had been a senior compliance officer for one of the city's largest development oversight committees. He'd resigned suddenly 2 years earlier. At the time, the story was burnout. "I was given your number," he continued, "by Daniel." Daniel again, always the ones who got pushed aside. "I don't know why you'd want to talk to me," I said carefully. "I think you do," Evan replied. "And I think it's time someone stopped pretending your father is untouchable." We met that evening at a bar near the river, the kind of place no one goes to be seen. He looked older than his age, tired in a way that comes from swallowing truth for too long. "I filed 3 reports," he said after we sat down. 3. All of them disappeared. Disappeared how I asked. Reclassified. Delayed. Buried under requests for additional review that never came, he said. Every time the same names surfaced. He slid his phone across the table, a list of internal communications pulled up on the screen. My father's name wasn't on them directly. It didn't need to be. The intermediaries were unmistakable. "This is bigger than you," Evan said quietly. "But you're the crack." That word stayed with me long after we left. The crack. By the end of the week, I had spoken to 5 people, former colleagues, consultants, one junior attorney who had been quietly reassigned after refusing to rubber stamp a zoning change. Every story was different. The shape was the same. Power wasn't loud, it was patient. And my father had mastered it. The hardest part wasn't the information. It was the realization that I had benefited from this system before it turned on me. My education, my early career, doors that opened more easily than they should have. I had told myself it was because I worked hard, and I had. But I had also been protected, until I wasn't. That night my mother called. Her voice was tight, controlled. "You're making things difficult." For who, I asked. "For everyone," she said. "People are talking. Leonard is under a lot of stress." "You mean he's being questioned?" I replied. "Because of you," she snapped. I smiled to myself, though she couldn't see it. "No," I said, "because of him." She went quiet. When she spoke again, her voice was colder. "You don't understand how this world works." "I understand it better than you think," I said. "I just stopped agreeing with it." She hung up. That was the moment I knew there would be no reconciliation. I didn't feel sad about it, just clear. The next call came from an investigative reporter named Hannah Price. She worked for a regional paper known for taking down institutions everyone else was afraid of. I had admired her work for years. "I hear you've been asking questions," she said. "I hear you've been answering some," I replied. We met the following afternoon. I told her everything I could verify. I gave her names, not theories, documents, not feelings. I refused to speculate where I couldn't prove. At the end, she sat back studying me. "Why now?" she asked. I thought of the dining room table. My mother's calm voice. The word cleaner. "Because silence was costing me my life," I said. She nodded slowly. "This will cost you more." "I know," I replied, "but I'm done paying quietly." The article didn't run immediately. Good journalism takes time. But something else happened. The calls stopped. No more pressure from former colleagues. No more veiled threats from family friends. No more polite inquiries that carried warnings between the lines. They had noticed, and they were afraid. One evening, as I was filing notes into a new folder labeled Simply Truth, my phone lit up again. "Claire." I let it ring. Then she texted, "Dad says you're trying to destroy him. Is that what you want?" I stared at the screen for a long time before replying. "I'm not destroying him. I'm letting him stand in the light." The typing bubble appeared, disappeared, appeared again. "You don't know what you're doing." I set the phone down without responding. For the first time in my life, I wasn't reacting to my family. I was moving without them. And that terrified them more than anger ever could. What I didn't yet know was that the most important truth hadn't surfaced yet. Not about my father. about my mother. And when it did, it would change everything I thought I was fighting for. I found out the truth about my mother on a Tuesday morning, the kind of morning that pretends to be ordinary. Gray sky, lukewarm coffee. My laptop opened to a spreadsheet of names and dates that had begun to feel like a second language. I was cross-checking correspondence from a zoning committee when an email notification slid across the top of my screen. Subject: re-old files you requested. The sender was Miriam Cole. The name made my stomach tighten. Miriam had been my mother's closest friend for more than 20 years. They met volunteering for the same charity board, bonded over their shared belief that appearances were everything. Miriam had watched me grow up. She'd hugged me at holidays, complimented my grades, told people I was bright, just a little headstrong. I hadn't spoken to her since Christmas. The email was short. Rachel, I don't know if I should be sending this, but after what I've seen happening, I can't stay silent anymore. Your mother asked me years ago to keep something locked away. I think you deserve to see it, Miriam. Attached was a scanned document. My hands shook as I opened it. It was a trust amendment, dated almost 15 years earlier. I read it once without understanding, then again slower. The trust was not my father's idea. It was my mother's. She had been the one to restructure the family assets. She had been the one to designate Claire as primary beneficiary. She had been the one to explicitly exclude me, citing emotional volatility and reputational risk. Emotional volatility. I felt sick. The document was notarized, signed, filed. My father's name was there but secondary, a formality. The architect of my erasure had been sitting across from me at that table, folding her napkin, speaking calmly about what was best for the family. I pushed my chair back and stood my legs unsteady. All those years I had believed my father was the decision-maker, the enforcer, the one who punished dissent. He was dangerous. But my mother was deliberate. Memory after memory snapped into place. The way she'd corrected my tone in public, the way she'd praised Claire's obedience, the way she'd told me over and over that being liked mattered more than being right. She hadn't been protecting the family. She had been curating it. I called Miriam immediately. I shouldn't have agreed, she said the moment she answered. Her voice trembled. She told me you'd thank her someday. That you were unstable, Rachel. That you needed boundaries. Boundaries, I repeated. She was afraid of you, Miriam said quietly. The word landed harder than betrayal. Afraid of what I asked. Of what you saw, she replied. Of what you questioned. Leonard bent rules, but your mother knew exactly where they were, and she knew you wouldn't play along. I thanked her and hung up. For a long time, I just stood there staring at the wall. This wasn't just family drama. This was strategy. I called Hannah, the reporter. I have something you need to see, I said. She arrived that afternoon, eyes sharp, notebook ready. I handed her the document without explanation. She read it once, then again. This changes everything, she said. Yes, I replied. Now you understand why I was cut out before I ever did anything wrong. Hannah leaned back slowly. This isn't just corruption, it's grooming. The word made my skin crawl. They shaped the narrative around you years in advance, she continued. By the time you challenged anything, they already had the excuse ready. I nodded, and now she said we show people how systems erase inconvenient women. The article ran a week later. Not about my father, about my mother. The headline didn't accuse, it didn't scream. It revealed. Inside the perfect family. How silence and strategy decide who belongs. It detailed the trust amendment. The language. The years of quiet positioning. The way dissent was framed as instability. It included expert commentary from estate attorneys and psychologists. It never called my mother cruel. It didn't need to. The reaction was immediate. Women I didn't know emailed me, mothers, daughters, sisters. She did this to me too. I was labeled difficult. They said I was emotional. They wrote me out before I ever spoke. My mother didn't call. My father didn't either. Instead, Claire showed up at my apartment that night. She looked shaken, pale in a way I'd never seen before. She planned it, Claire said the moment I opened the door. All of it. I stepped aside to let her in. I found letters, she continued, pacing, notes, drafts. She decided years ago that you were a liability. I watched her carefully. And you, I asked. She stopped moving. I believed her, she said softly. I thought I was protecting you by staying quiet. The words were familiar. Protection. Silence. I felt no urge to comfort her. You benefited from it, I said. She nodded, tears spilling. I know. For the first time, I didn't feel angry at Claire. I felt detached. The system had rewarded her compliance and punished my refusal. She was collateral too, in a different way. I'm leaving, she said suddenly. I can't stay there anymore. I didn't ask where she was going. That was her reckoning, not mine. After she left, I sat alone in the quiet apartment, my phone buzzing non-stop with messages from journalists, advocates, and people who had been watching from the shadows. The story had shifted. This was no longer about one powerful man abusing influence. It was about how families train women to police each other, how obedience is inherited, how silence is rewarded, and how the woman who refuses becomes the threat. That night, my mother finally called. Her voice was calm, too calm. "You've crossed a line," she said. I smiled to myself. "No," I replied, "I found it." The silence on the other end was the most honest thing she'd ever given me, and for the first time I understood exactly who I was fighting. Not a single villain, but a legacy of control dressed up as love. And now that legacy was cracking, right where she thought it was strongest. The pressure changed after the article about my mother ran. Before, the resistance had been obvious. Calls that stopped being returned, meetings canceled without explanation, the quiet closing of doors I was never meant to notice. Now it became subtler, smarter, the kind of pushback designed to make you doubt yourself rather than confront an enemy you could name. That was my mother's world. I started receiving concerned emails from distant relatives. Old family friends who hadn't spoken to me in years suddenly wanted to check in. Their words were soft, sympathetic, and carefully aligned. "We're worried about you. This stress can't be healthy. Your mother is heartbroken." No one asked if I was telling the truth. They asked if I was okay. I recognized the tactic immediately. It was the same one used on me growing up. Frame dissent as distress. Convince everyone that the problem isn't what's being said but who is saying it. One afternoon, as I was organizing interview notes for Hannah, my phone rang from an unknown number. "Rachel Walsh," a woman said. Her voice was measured, professional. "This is Dr. Ellen Kramer." The name meant nothing to me until she continued. "I was contacted by your mother. She expressed concern about your mental health and asked if I would be willing to conduct an evaluation." I went very still. "An evaluation for what?" I asked. "For emotional instability," she replied almost apologetically. She said, "You've been exhibiting obsessive behavior and paranoia." I laughed once sharply. "Did she also tell you she wrote me out of the trust 15 years ago?" There was a pause. "No," Dr. Kramer said. "I didn't think so," I replied. "This call is inappropriate. Do not contact me again." I hung up and sat there, my heart pounding. My mother wasn't trying to win an argument. She was trying to discredit me permanently. That was when I understood something crucial. This wasn't just about inheritance or reputation or control. This was about erasure. If she could convince enough people that I was unstable, everything I said could be dismissed without being examined. The documents, the timelines, the truth itself would become suspect. I called Hannah immediately. "She's escalating," I said. "She's trying to medicalize dissent." Hannah was quiet for a moment, then we pivot. "To what?" "To proof," she said. "Not your story, her pattern." Within days, Hannah and her team began reaching out to former associates of my mother, charity boards, social committees, estate planners, women who had once admired her and later disappeared from her orbit. The responses came slowly at first, then faster. She decided who belonged. If you crossed her, you were iced out. She smiled while she ruined people. One woman agreed to go on record. Another provided emails. A third shared a journal entry written years earlier describing the moment she realized my mother was quietly undermining her credibility behind closed doors. It was never loud. It was never traceable to a single incident. It was cumulative. That was the danger. Meanwhile, my father finally reached out, not directly, through his attorney. The letter arrived in a heavy envelope, the kind meant to intimidate. It accused me of defamation, emotional harm, and interference with private family matters. It demanded I retract statements, cease communication with the press, and publicly apologize. I handed it to my own lawyer, Maya Chen, without comment. She read it carefully, then looked up at me. "They don't have a case." "I know," I said, "but they want to scare me." She nodded. "They want you quiet." "They've always wanted that," I replied. Maya smiled faintly. "They picked the wrong woman." The next meeting with Hannah was different. We weren't reacting anymore. We were shaping the narrative. "This isn't about your family," she said. "It's about how power hides in private spaces, how women who enforce silence are rewarded." I leaned back in my chair, exhaustion creeping in around the edges. I didn't want to become a symbol. "You didn't choose it," she said, "but you can use it." That night alone in my apartment, I replayed my childhood with new eyes. The times my mother corrected me in front of others. The way she'd say, "Rachel doesn't mean it that way," when I spoke plainly. the way she'd praise Claire for being easy, adaptable, pleasant. I had been marked early, not as a failure, as a threat. The next confrontation came sooner than expected. I was leaving a coffee shop when I saw her standing across the street. My mother. She hadn't called, hadn't warned me. She was just there, her coat perfectly pressed, her posture immaculate, as if she were attending a luncheon instead of ambushing her youngest daughter. She crossed the street slowly. "You've humiliated this family," she said without greeting. I felt oddly calm. "You humiliated yourself." Her eyes narrowed. "You're unraveling." I smiled. "You taught me how to recognize manipulation. I just stopped mistaking it for love." She took a step closer. "You think people believe you?" "I know they do," I replied, "because they recognize the pattern." Her voice dropped sharp. "You were never meant to carry this weight." "No," I said, "I was meant to disappear under it." For the first time, her composure cracked, just slightly. "You'll regret this," she said. I met her gaze. "I already survived you." She turned and walked away without another word. I stood there for a long moment, my hands trembling, the adrenaline finally releasing. That was the moment I knew. This wasn't revenge driven by rage. It was justice driven by clarity. And clarity is something no amount of control can withstand. Because once the truth is seen clearly enough, it stops being personal. It becomes inevitable. And my mother, for all her careful planning, had never learned how to survive that. The first official investigation began quietly. No press release, no announcement, just a formal notice sent to my father's office and copied to a handful of regulatory agencies. I didn't learn about it from the news. I learned about it because my father showed up at my apartment building at 7:40 in the morning, looking older than I had ever seen him. He waited in the lobby, didn't call, didn't text, just stood there, hands clasped in front of him like a man waiting outside a hospital room. The concierge buzzed me. "There's a Mr. Walsh here to see you." I closed my eyes for a moment, then said, "Send him up." When he stepped inside, the air changed, not tense, heavy, like something that had been carried too long and was finally being set down. "You've done enough," he said without sitting. I gestured to the chair anyway. He ignored it. "They're auditing contracts," he continued, "looking at things from years ago. People are panicking." "People," I repeated, "or you?" His jaw tightened. "This doesn't end well for anyone." "That depends," I said calmly, "on what you mean by end." He finally sat, shoulders slumping just slightly. It was the first time I had ever seen him look unsure in my presence. "Your mother is beside herself," he said. "She's not sleeping. She's convinced this is a personal vendetta." I laughed softly. "She made it personal long before I did." He rubbed his temples. "You don't understand the consequences." "I understand them perfectly," I replied. "I lived with them my entire life." Silence settled between us. Then he said the thing I had been waiting years to hear. "We should have handled you differently. Not we should have loved you differently. Not we should have listened." Handled. I stood. "That's exactly the problem," I said. "You never saw me as a daughter, just a variable." He looked up startled. "What do you want?" he asked finally. There it was, the negotiation. "I want the truth on record," I said. "All of it. No backroom deals, no pressure campaigns, no more calling me unstable when I refuse to comply." "And if we give you that?" he asked. "I stop protecting you," I replied. His eyes widened. "You are protecting us." "Yes," I said simply, "by not releasing everything I have." That was when fear finally crossed his face, raw and unfiltered. I walked to my desk and pulled out a folder. Not the full archive, just enough. I set it on the table between us. "You taught me how power works," I said, "how silence is enforced, how favors move. I watched. I learned. You just never imagined I'd use it." He stared at the folder like it might bite him. "You think this makes you powerful?" he said weakly. "No," I replied, "it makes me finished being powerless." He left without taking the folder. 2 days later, the second article dropped. This one wasn't about my mother, or even my father directly. It was about systems, about how family-owned development firms quietly bypass oversight through personal networks, how dissenters are discredited, how women who ask questions are labeled emotional, while men who break rules are called strategic. My story was in it, but it wasn't centered. That was intentional. The backlash was swift. My parents' friends closed ranks publicly, issuing statements of support. But behind the scenes, people began distancing themselves, declining invitations, canceling meetings, returning calls slower than usual. Power hates attention, especially sustained attention. Claire called me late one night, her voice shaking. "They're fighting constantly," she said. "Mom is convinced you're trying to destroy her. Dad says you're ruining the business. They barely speak to each other anymore." I felt a flicker of something then, Not guilt, not satisfaction. Recognition. This was the cost of a system built on control. When it cracks, it collapses inward. I'm not doing this to them, I said gently. I'm doing it despite them. She sniffed. I don't know where I belong anymore. You don't have to decide that now, I replied. Just stop letting them decide for you. After we hung up, I sat in the dark, the glow of the city washing over the room. The investigation expanded. Former employees were contacted, documents requested, timelines scrutinized, and then something unexpected happened. People started thanking me. Not publicly, quietly. Emails from former city planners, texts from junior analysts, notes slipped under my door from people who recognized the pattern and had never had the language for it. You said what I couldn't. You stood where I froze. Thank you for not backing down. That was when the narrative shifted for me. This wasn't revenge. It was interruption. I wasn't burning their world down. I was forcing it to stop pretending it was fine. One evening, as I was organizing new files, I came across an old home video I had digitized years ago. I almost skipped it. Curiosity won. The footage was grainy. A birthday party. I was maybe 9. Claire was helping me blow out candles. My mother hovered just outside the frame, correcting someone's posture. My father was laughing with guests. At one point, I said something I couldn't quite hear. The adults laughed awkwardly. My mother leaned in and whispered sharply, her smile never leaving her face. I paused the video. That moment. That was when it started. I closed the laptop. The past didn't hurt the way it used to. It felt explanatory. The next day, my lawyer called. They want mediation, she said. Your parents, privately. I smiled slowly. Tell them no, I replied. If they want to speak, they can do it in daylight. Because the truth doesn't need negotiating. It just needs room. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of how much space it would take. The first subpoena arrived on a Wednesday afternoon. It wasn't addressed to me. That was how I knew things had crossed the line no one could retreat from. The envelope was delivered to my parents' house, but the copy sent to the legal teams reached Hannah first. She called me immediately, her voice tight with excitement and caution. They're not fishing anymore, she said. They're building. By the end of the week, 3 former executives from my father's firm had been called to testify. One resigned before the paperwork was even filed. Another hired a criminal defense attorney instead of the civil specialist he'd used for decades. Those were not the actions of innocent men. My parents stopped trying to contact me directly after that. The shift was unmistakable. No more emotional appeals, no more warnings disguised as concern. They moved into survival mode, closing ranks, speaking only through counsel. That silence should have felt like relief. Instead, it felt like standing in the eye of a storm. Because I knew what was coming next. The retaliation wouldn't be loud. It would be personal. I felt it when my landlord emailed to inform me that my lease would not be renewed. No explanation, just a polite notice and a deadline. The building had been owned by the same investment group my father had advised for years. I packed calmly. Moved to a smaller place across town with windows that didn't face the street and neighbors who minded their business. I paid in advance, changed my routine, not because I was afraid, but because I was finished underestimating how quietly power could inconvenience you into exhaustion. 2 days later, the smear campaign started. Anonymous posts, carefully worded op-eds questioning my motives, whispered suggestions that I was leveraging trauma for attention, that I was unstable, obsessed, vindictive. The old script, only this time it didn't land the way they expected, because something had changed. People were asking questions. When one commentator referred to me as emotionally compromised, a former judge publicly pushed back, citing the documented evidence and reminding readers that credibility is not measured by compliance. When a family friend implied I was exaggerating, 3 former employees came forward with corroborating timelines. The narrative wouldn't stay contained. It never does once daylight hits it. I received an email late one night from someone named Judith Hale. She was in her early 60s, a retired estate attorney. Her message was short. I drafted a version of your parents' trust years ago. What is on record is not what I advised. If you're willing to talk, so am I. We met the following morning. Judith had been careful for decades. She had built a career on discretion. But she was tired now. Tired of watching the same patterns repeat while people like my mother were praised for elegance and restraint. She insisted on language that would allow flexibility, Judith said. Not for you, for herself. She explained how the trust had been designed with contingency clauses that allowed assets to be shifted quietly under the guise of protection. how dissenting heirs could be sidelined without formal conflict. She wasn't emotional, Judith said. She was meticulous. That word again. The architect. I asked the question I'd been circling for weeks. Why didn't you stop her? Judith didn't flinch. Because at the time she was untouchable, and I told myself someone else would push back. We sat in silence for a moment. I'm pushing back now, she added quietly. The following article hit harder than anything before it. It wasn't sensational, it didn't need to be. It showed how wealth can be weaponized through legal nuance, how family dynamics are encoded into contracts, how women like my mother learn to operate within patriarchal systems by becoming their most effective enforcers. It named names, not mine, hers. The backlash was immediate. Charity boards suspended my mother pending review, invitations dried up. The social circles she had curated for decades went quiet. Not with confrontation, but with absence. The punishment she feared most, being excluded. Claire showed up again unannounced, standing in my doorway with red eyes and shaking hands. She's unraveling, she said. She keeps saying you betrayed her. I leaned against the doorframe. She betrayed herself. She doesn't understand why this is happening, Claire whispered. She thought control meant safety. That's the lie, I said. Control just delays accountability. Claire looked at me, then really looked at me like she was seeing me for the first time without the family script running in her head. I don't know who I am without her voice telling me what's right, she said. That's not a failure, I replied. That's a beginning. She stayed for hours. We didn't talk about forgiveness. We didn't rewrite the past. We talked about practical things. Boundaries, money, therapy, what it means to build an identity that isn't rewarded for obedience. After she left, I sat alone and finally let myself feel something I had been avoiding. Grief. Not for the family I lost, for the one I never had. The version where love wasn't conditional, where curiosity wasn't punished, where my voice wasn't framed as danger. I cried then, quietly, without shame. The next morning, my attorney called. They're offering a settlement, she said. I smiled sadly. Of course they are. They want non-disclosure, silence, an apology framed as reconciliation. I looked out the window at the early light stretching across the city. No, I said, I don't want their money. I want their story finished. She paused. This won't end cleanly. I know, I replied, but it will end honestly. As I hung up, my phone buzzed with a message from Hannah. Tomorrow, major development, be ready. I exhaled slowly. The storm wasn't passing. It was breaking, and this time I wasn't standing in the wreckage. I was standing in the open, watching the truth finally do what it always does when it's given room. It changes everything. The press conference wasn't announced until the morning of. That was deliberate. No time to spin, no time to rehearse outrage, just facts released into the open air where they could no longer be reshaped behind closed doors. Hannah texted me a single line. It's bigger than we thought. I arrived early and stood at the back of the room unnoticed. Reporters filled the seats, murmuring to each other, phones already in hand. A long table faced the audience with name placards neatly arranged. State investigators, ethics officials, a representative from the Financial Crimes Unit. My parents were not there. That absence spoke louder than anything else. When the lead investigator stepped to the podium, the room fell quiet. This inquiry began as a review of irregular development approvals, he said. It has expanded into a broader examination of influence, financial misrepresentation, and abuse of fiduciary responsibility. He didn't mention my name. He didn't need to. Slide after slide appeared behind him. Timelines, charts, communication networks, shell entities tied to legitimate firms. Legal structures used not to protect assets but to obscure accountability. The room shifted as understanding spread. This wasn't one bad decision. It was a system. Then came the part that made my hands shake. The investigation also uncovered evidence of deliberate character undermining. The investigator continued, his voice steady, including attempts to medically discredit individuals who raised concerns and the manipulation of family trusts to silence dissent. A ripple moved through the room. That was my mother, not by name, but by method. When the conference ended, reporters surged forward. Questions flew, names were asked, some answered, some deferred. Hannah found me near the exit. You ready, she asked. For what, I replied. For the part where they ask you why you did this. I took a breath. I didn't do this. I stopped it. The interview aired that night. I spoke carefully, plainly. I didn't attack. I didn't dramatize. I told the truth the way women learn to when they know emotion will be used against them. I was excluded from my family's trust long before I ever spoke out, I said. Not because I was unstable, but because I asked questions. This isn't about revenge, it's about accountability. The response was immediate. Not praise, recognition. My inbox filled with messages from women across the country, some older than my mother, some younger than me, all carrying variations of the same story. They said I was difficult, they said I was emotional, they said I couldn't be trusted. And then something unexpected happened. A former board member from one of my mother's charities went public. Then another. Then a third. They didn't accuse, they corroborated. Each story added weight, context, texture. Patterns are harder to deny when they repeat. By the end of the week, the narrative had shifted completely. This was no longer a family dispute. It was a case study. Universities reached out. Ethics panels requested commentary. Legal journals published analyses of how private power corrodes public trust when left unchallenged. I declined most invitations. I wasn't interested in becoming a symbol. I was interested in finishing what had started. That finish came quietly. A certified letter arrived at my new address, from my parents' attorney. Inside was a formal notice of separation of interests. My name was removed from all future communications regarding the family estate, not because I was being cut out again, because the trust itself was being dissolved under court supervision. The mechanism my mother had built to control outcomes was being dismantled piece by piece. I sat on the floor and read the letter twice. Then I laughed. Not because I had won, but because the thing they had used to erase me no longer existed. Claire called that night. "They're moving," she said, "selling the house." I pictured the dining room, the candles, the word cleaner. "How is she?" I asked. "She's furious," Claire replied, "and scared." That surprised me. Of what, I asked. "Of being seen," she said. That made sense. For someone like my mother, visibility without control is terror. "I'm staying away," Claire continued. "I've found an apartment. I start therapy next week." I smiled softly. "I'm glad." There was a pause. "I'm sorry," she said, "for believing the version of you that made things easier." "I know," I replied, and I meant it. After we hung up, I stood at the window and watched the city lights flicker on one by one. The world looked unchanged. Cars moved, people hurried, restaurants filled. But something fundamental had shifted. I wasn't fighting anymore. I wasn't defending myself. The truth had done what it always does when it's given time and witnesses. It had stood on its own. That night, as I shut off the lights, I felt a strange calm settle in my chest. Not relief, resolution. The war wasn't over yet, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Because power that relies on silence collapses the moment someone refuses to provide it. And I had been quiet long enough. When the silence finally came, it was louder than any accusation. No calls from lawyers, no messages from journalists, no urgent emails demanding comment. The story had reached a point where it no longer needed me to keep moving. Institutions were responding to other institutions now, committees reviewing committees, boards auditing boards. The machine had turned inward. That should have felt like the end. Instead, it felt like standing on the edge of something unfinished. I realized then that everything up to this point had been exposure. What came next would be consequence. It started with the company. My father's firm announced a temporary restructuring that everyone understood was permanent. Senior leadership stepped down one by one, citing health, family, personal reasons. The language was polite, but the effect was brutal. Contracts were frozen, partnerships dissolved, projects stalled. People who had once returned my father's calls within minutes suddenly required weeks. Power does not disappear all at once, it leaks. I ran into an old family friend at the grocery store one evening. A woman who used to bring elaborate desserts to holidays, who once told me I should smile more if I wanted people to trust me. She looked startled to see me. "I didn't know if I should say hello," she admitted. "You just did," I replied calmly. She hesitated, then lowered her voice. "Your parents are not well." "I'm aware," I said. "They never thought it would go this far," she added. I met her eyes. "That's usually how consequences work." She flushed and muttered an excuse before pushing her cart away. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt clarity. A week later, my lawyer called. "There's a civil case forming," she said. "Former partners, minority investors, people who were sidelined." "Against my father?" I asked. "And others," she replied. "Your mother may be named." That word landed heavier than I expected. Named. For all her careful maneuvering, for all her behind-the-scenes control, she would be visible now. Not as a wife, not as a volunteer, not as a pillar of the community, as a participant. I sat with that for a long time after we hung up. The temptation to step back surfaced, then sharp and unexpected. I could walk away, let the system finish its work without me. protect what little distance remained between me and the wreckage of my family. But distance had never protected me before. Only truth had. I agreed to testify. Not with drama, not with vengeance, with precision. The deposition was held in a quiet office building downtown. Neutral carpet, neutral walls, neutral everything, designed to feel forgettable. It wasn't. Across the table sat my parents' attorneys. Professional, polite, careful. They asked questions the way people do when they're searching for weakness rather than facts. They didn't find any. I answered clearly. I didn't speculate. I didn't editorialize. I referenced documents, dates, emails, trust language. When asked about my emotional state, I smiled faintly and said, consistent. When asked if I felt betrayed, I replied I felt informed. That seemed to unsettle them more than anger ever could. My mother arrived late. She did not look at me. She sat perfectly straight, her face composed, her hands folded. The picture of dignity she had cultivated for decades. When it was her turn to speak, she described me the way she always had. Sensitive, intense, imaginative. I listened without interruption. Then my attorney asked a single question. Mrs. Walsh, can you explain why you amended the trust to exclude your daughter 15 years before any alleged instability occurred? The room went very still. My mother hesitated. Just long enough. That pause said more than any answer. After the deposition, I walked outside into the late afternoon light. My legs felt heavy, but my chest felt light in a way I hadn't known was possible. I hadn't defended myself. I had simply told the truth. That night, Claire called. I watched the recording, she said. I waited. She didn't deny it, Claire continued. She reframed it, like always. Yes, I said, that's her pattern. I don't think she knows how to stop, Claire whispered. I closed my eyes. Neither did I, at first. There was a long pause. I'm proud of you, Claire said quietly. It was the first time she'd ever said that without qualifying it. Something loosened in my chest. The civil case moved forward. So did something else. The foundation Hannah and I had discussed in passing months earlier took shape. Not in my name, not as a monument. As a tool, a legal advocacy fund for people pushed out of family businesses under the guise of instability or incompatibility. A place to document patterns, to provide counsel, to make silence harder to enforce. Applications poured in, stories poured out. It became clear this was bigger than my family ever had been. One evening, alone in my apartment, I pulled out an old notebook from a box I hadn't unpacked since moving. Inside were sketches, notes, half-formed ideas about ethics, systems, accountability, things I'd written as a teenager and been told were naive. I flipped through the pages slowly. They weren't naive. They were unfinished. I realized then that my parents hadn't just underestimated me. They had misunderstood me. They thought exclusion would make me small. It had given me focus. The next morning, a message appeared on my phone from an unfamiliar number. It was my mother. Just one line. You've made your point. I stared at it for a long time. Then I typed a response. No, I made my life. And I blocked the number. That was the moment I knew. The power had not shifted back to me. It had left the room entirely. And in its absence, something better had taken root. Not control. Not dominance. But choice. And that, I had learned, was the one thing they could never take from me again. The trial date was set for early fall, the kind of timing that pretends to be neutral but never is. By then, the leaves would be turning. The city would look calm on the surface while everything underneath prepared to change. I didn't attend the hearings leading up to it. My attorney handled those. Motions, objections, negotiations that were less about truth and more about damage control. I stayed focused on the foundation, on building something that existed beyond my parents' shadow. That was when the offer came. Not from them, from the company. A new board had been installed under court supervision. Independent directors, compliance officers, people who spoke in careful sentences and wore neutrality like armor. They requested a meeting. I agreed. We sat in a glass conference room overlooking the river. The city moved below us, boats cutting through water that looked calm but hid strong currents. The chairwoman spoke first. We want to resolve this without further harm. To whom I asked. She didn't flinch. To everyone. I nodded. That usually means the people with the most to lose. She sighed. We're offering a settlement. Go on. Financial compensation. A public statement acknowledging wrongdoing. Your parents would step back permanently. And I asked. And you would agree not to pursue further action. There it was. Closure packaged neatly. I looked around the table at faces that wanted this finished, wrapped, archived, People who believed justice was a transaction. What about the trust, I asked. The chairwoman glanced at her notes. It would remain dissolved. And the record, I continued. The documentation of how dissent was silenced. We'd prefer not to set a precedent, she said carefully. I smiled. That's the problem, I replied. You already did. I declined the offer. They looked surprised, confused, a little offended. You could walk away with security, one of them said. Comfort. I already walked away, I replied. From the thing that taught me comfort mattered more than truth. The fallout was immediate. My father's attorneys filed a motion accusing me of acting in bad faith, of refusing reasonable compromise, of dragging personal grievances into a professional arena. The judge denied it. The civil case proceeded. That was when the final twist revealed itself. A former assistant to my mother contacted me through the foundation's secure portal. Her message was brief but urgent. I kept records, she told me to. We met in a quiet cafe on the edge of town. She looked nervous, her hands shaking as she stirred her tea. She made me catalog everything the woman said. Phone calls, letters, drafts. She said it was protection. For whom, I asked. For her, she replied. She slid a flash drive across the table. Insurance, she said. I took it home and opened the files slowly. There were emails, audio recordings, handwritten notes scanned and archived. And at the center of it all was a pattern I hadn't fully seen before. My mother hadn't just planned my exclusion. She had planned my replacement, years before Claire's engagement, before the trust amendment, before the first article ever ran. There were notes about positioning Claire as the public face of the family, about grooming her to inherit not just assets but narrative, about managing my visibility, limiting my influence, framing me as volatile if I ever resisted. One line stood out. Rachel must never be allowed to appear credible in conflict. I stared at the screen until my eyes burned. This wasn't fear, this was strategy. I handed everything to my attorney. This changes the case, she said quietly. The evidence was introduced 2 weeks later. My mother's legal team objected, delayed, attempted to suppress. They failed. The courtroom was full the day the recordings were played. My mother sat perfectly still as her own voice filled the room, calm, precise, calculating. There was no yelling, no cruelty, just intention. The judge listened without expression. The room shifted. When it was over, the verdict came faster than anyone expected. Liability was established. Damages were awarded. But more importantly, injunctions were issued. Permanent ones. My mother was barred from serving on boards, from managing trusts, from acting in any fiduciary capacity. The tool she had used to control outcomes was taken from her completely. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered. Cameras flashed. I didn't stop. I walked past them out into the sunlight, breathing deeply for the first time in days. Claire caught up with me on the steps. It's over, she said. I shook my head gently. It's finished. There's a difference. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, the city humming softly outside. I thought about the girl at the far end of the table, the one told she didn't fit, the one erased before she ever spoke. I thought about how revenge is often imagined as destruction. But the truth is quieter. Revenge, when done right, is reclamation. It's refusing to accept the role assigned to you. It's living so fully, so honestly that the system built to silence you has no place to stand. I poured myself a glass of wine and raised it to the window. Not to victory, to clarity, because in the end I didn't take their power. I exposed it. And once exposed, it dissolved on its own. The final chapter wasn't about what I gained. It was about what I refused to carry any longer. And that changed everything. After the verdict, people expected me to disappear for a while, to retreat, to rest, to lick wounds that everyone assumed must still be bleeding. Strangers spoke to me with a gentleness that felt misplaced, like I was something fragile that might crack if handled too firmly. They didn't understand. The trial hadn't broken me. It had clarified me. The days that followed were strangely quiet. No court dates, no emergency calls from attorneys, no reporters circling outside my building. The noise that had filled my life for nearly a year drained away, leaving behind a silence that was no longer threatening. It was spacious. I slept better than I had in decades. I woke without dread, without that low hum of anticipation that something bad was about to happen. For the first time, my nervous system wasn't braced for impact. That was when the grief arrived. Not the sharp kind, not the dramatic kind, the slow kind. The grief for a mother who chose control over love, for a father who chose comfort over courage, for a childhood where I learned too early that approval was conditional and silence was safety. I let myself feel it. I didn't numb it with work. I didn't outrun it with productivity. I sat with it, walked with it, let it breathe. Healing, I learned, isn't about forgetting. It's about no longer flinching when you remember. The foundation grew steadily during that time, not explosively, thoughtfully. We built a small legal network. We partnered with therapists who understood family trauma tied to money and power. We created documentation templates for people who didn't yet know they were being erased, but felt it happening. The stories came in waves. A woman in her late 50s cut out of her family business after questioning her brother's ethics. A daughter labeled unstable after refusing to support a fraudulent estate plan. A granddaughter pressured into silence with threats of disinheritance. Different names, same script. I stopped seeing my story as singular. It was a pattern. One afternoon, I received a letter forwarded from my attorney's office. The envelope was plain. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded carefully. It was my mother's handwriting. Not angry, not defensive. Tired. She wrote that she had never imagined things would end this way. That she had believed control was protection. That she had done what she thought was necessary to keep the family intact. She did not apologize. She did not ask for forgiveness. She asked for understanding. I read the letter once. Then I folded it back into the envelope and placed it in a drawer. Understanding does not require reconciliation. That distinction saved me. Claire visited a few weeks later. She looked lighter somehow, less tightly wound. She talked about her therapy sessions, about learning to recognize when her thoughts weren't her own, about how difficult it was to realize how much of her identity had been shaped by compliance. I don't know who I am without their expectations, she admitted. That's normal, I said. You weren't allowed to find out before. She smiled sadly. You were. No, I corrected gently. I just refused to stop asking. We sat together in silence for a while. Not awkward, just honest. I don't expect us to be close, she said eventually, but I'd like us to be real. I can do real, I replied. That was enough. I heard through distant channels that my parents had separated. Not formally, not publicly, but the house had been sold. The routines dismantled, the social calendar emptied. People who build their identity on control don't survive well without it. I didn't take pleasure in that. I took distance. The last professional loose end resolved quietly. The company rebranded under new leadership. Compliance measures were implemented. Oversight structures formalized. The machine adapted as machines do. My name faded from headlines, and that was a relief. One evening I returned home from a long walk and found a small package waiting by my door. No note, no sender. Inside was a childhood photograph. Me sitting on the living room floor, surrounded by papers and markers, building something out of cardboard. Focused, serious, unbothered by the chaos around me. On the back in unfamiliar handwriting was a single sentence. You always knew who you were. I didn't recognize the handwriting, but I didn't need to. That night I stood by the window and watched the city settle into itself. Lights dimming, traffic thinning, people moving toward rest. I realized something then. Justice had come. Not loudly, not cleanly, but fully. And it hadn't given me what I thought I wanted. It had given me myself. The final chapter wasn't waiting in a courtroom or a settlement. It was waiting in how I chose to live now that I was no longer defined by what had been taken from me. The last thing my family ever taught me was how to survive their silence. The next thing I taught myself was how to live without it. And that I understood was the real victory. The last time I drove past my parents' old house, the windows were dark. No wreath on the door, no lights outlining the roofline. The manicured hedges my mother once inspected weekly had grown uneven, a little wild, as if the land itself had relaxed now that no one was correcting it. I didn't stop the car. I didn't need to. That place no longer held anything of mine. Instead, I drove to the coast, rented a small place for a few days, and let myself exist without an agenda. No meetings, no interviews, no strategy. Just mornings with coffee and the sound of waves hitting the shore in steady, unbothered rhythms. It took me a while to understand why that sound felt so grounding. The ocean doesn't negotiate. It doesn't apologize for its force or ask permission to take up space. It moves, reshapes, erodes, rebuilds, entirely indifferent to who approves. I sat on the sand one afternoon and realized how much of my life I had spent bracing, reading rooms, adjusting tone, softening truth so it would be easier for others to swallow. I wasn't doing that anymore. The foundation held its first closed-door summit that spring. No press, no donors seeking recognition. Just women sitting in a circle, many of them over 50, some with decades of silence behind their eyes. Business owners, former spouses, daughters who had been written out of wills and written off as unstable when they protested. They didn't need motivation. They needed language. As they spoke, patterns emerged so clearly it was almost frightening. The same phrases, the same tactics, the same emotional traps dressed up as concern. You're too emotional. You're misremembering. This is for your own good. When it was my turn, I didn't give a speech. I told them the truth. I didn't win because I was stronger, I said. I won because I stopped cooperating with my own erasure. That landed. One woman reached for my hand afterward and whispered I thought I was crazy for 30 years. You weren't, I said. You were inconvenient. That word mattered. Inconvenient women don't disappear quietly. They get managed, controlled, diagnosed, disinherited, pushed to the margins, and told it's love. The months passed. Life filled in around the work instead of being consumed by it. I cooked more, walked more, slept deeply. I started writing again, not evidence or timelines, but reflections, things I might never publish, things meant only to remind myself of who I am when no one is watching. Claire and I settled into something resembling peace. Not closeness, not distance, honesty. We spoke when it mattered. We didn't pretend it had all been fair or forgivable. My parents remained ghosts, occasionally referenced, rarely discussed. I heard my mother had moved into a smaller place in another town, that she no longer chaired anything, that she told people she was tired, that she wanted a quieter life. I believed her. Control takes energy. Without it, exhaustion catches up. One evening, almost a year to the day, after that Christmas dinner, I hosted a small gathering in my apartment. Nothing formal, a few friends, a few women from the foundation. Food served family-style, laughter loose and unforced. No seating hierarchy, no scripts. At one point, I caught myself watching the table waiting for the familiar tension to rise. It never did. Later that night, after everyone had left, I sat alone with a glass of wine and thought about revenge. Real revenge, I had learned, doesn't look like destruction. It looks like freedom. It looks like a life so full and self-directed that the people who tried to control you no longer have any role in the story at all. They become a footnote, a lesson, nothing more. I don't hate my parents. Hate still gives too much energy to people who misused it. What I feel now is something quieter, detachment, and with it, peace. If you're listening to this and something in your chest feels tight, if you've ever been told you were too much for asking fair questions, too unstable for refusing to comply, too difficult for wanting truth, hear this clearly. You were not the problem. You were the interruption, and interruptions are how broken systems are exposed. You don't need their apology. You don't need their permission. And you don't need to be included in something that only exists to keep you small. Sometimes being excluded is the moment your real life begins. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. If you've lived something similar, your story matters. Tell it in the comments. And if you believe dignity is not inherited, not granted, but claimed, subscribe and stay with me. Because the most powerful thing a woman can do at any age is stop asking for a seat at a table that was never built for her, and build her own instead.